So, everybody's talking about AI agents. We've already looked at what is happening in the industry, what are the biggest myths we want to bust, and now we'll talk about what's next. So, stick around, we're just getting started. Hey, welcome to What's the Buzz, where leaders share how they've turned AI hype into business outcomes. Today we'll talk about what's next with AI agents, and I'm so excited to have Jon Reed, esteemed analyst and co-founder of Diginomica, with me again. Hey, Jon, thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, so glad to be back. It's really been great to have this dialogue going this summer, and it's been great to get the feedback on it as well. And I'd like to think we're getting somewhere, but things are also moving really fast. So we'll see how we do.
Yeah, exactly. Look, I mean, the first two episodes that we've run were a huge success. We had lots of great feedback, like I said, lots of interest and people engaging in a good dialogue. So if you have any questions in the audience, please feel free to put them in the chat. We're super excited to hear from you, and we'll answer them as we go along here. But Jon, without further ado, obviously it's been an amazing summer. We've come from the spring event series. We are seeing now agents mature a little more. We're talking more about security, it feels, and trust and authentication and these kind of things. But to me, those are only just some of the topics of what's next. What are you seeing? What's next for you?
Well, every day is kind of a different day, and it's actually been kind of, I think, a pretty significant week. I mean, it's going to be interesting heading into the fall event season. A lot of big shows on deck. I know you're going to a number of them also, and we're really going to get kind of a gut check pretty soon on customer adoption and where everything stands. But one thing I thought was really fascinating just in the last week, you had the underwhelming release of GPT-5 with even a lot of AI fanboys disappointed in the release. And I think the big takeaway, I think more than anything, is that traditional approaches to just throwing data scale at AI problems aren't working very well. And we're seeing a real divide, I think, now between the big AI companies and this pursuit of artificial general intelligence, which we could debate, versus a really different approach to enterprise use cases that I think is far more promising, that recognizes more technical limitations and constraints, but then applies them very cleverly to enterprise and industry scenarios. And we could talk a little more about that and why I think that's a really, really important distinction, because you can run the risk of thinking, well, if these models are underwhelming, then they're not going to work for my project. And along those lines, this week, I think, was another instructive thing, because we saw a ton of headlines for this so-called MIT study that 95% of generative AI projects fail. Now, what's interesting about that is that as soon as that came out, a bunch of people published little articles on it, none of which I think were particularly insightful. And then it turns out to be a group inside of MIT that is working, I think, on some specific stuff around agentic AI. They immediately pulled the study offline. I found it. But so now we're all talking about a study that no one can actually really find. I think that's a really good summary of like the potential for confusion. And actually, when you dig into the study, and we can maybe talk a little bit about it today, it's actually not like this damning, like we can't do anything with AI thing. And in fact, what they found, alongside the idea that 95% of these pilots that they looked at in their study, which is a pretty small sample size, by the way, a few hundred companies, but 95% didn't get past the pilot phase. But I think the tantalizing part is the 5% that did had really big success.
Right.
So that's a really interesting thing too, which is like not just small success, but big success. And the other interesting thing is that when you dug further into the study, and I don't know totally how to reconcile this yet, but there were different numbers that indicated that 30% of projects were successful on their own, but more like closer to 65% were successful when working with an external vendor. And this is something we talked about in past episodes, where I think a lot of customers are going to do well right now to avoid trying to recreate their own cutting edge AI architectures, but churning instead to trusted vendors to help manage the complexities of these environments. So anyway, I just think it's really interesting because just in a week's time, we had so many interesting juxtapositions between different ways of thinking about the exact same thing. So
Yeah, right. And see, I mean, it's hard to comment without coming across as being a little cocky. But I think if you've been in the trenches, if you've seen this play out over the last few hype cycles, machine learning being one of them, you know that it's not that easy. It's not that simple. It's not just about the low-hanging fruit and let's boil the ocean and see what we can do with this magical technology. It's about, where do we have a problem? Can we measure the impact? And can we solve it with the data we have and with the technology that's available? In very, very few cases, technology is the limiting factor, right? It's either we haven't really understood or articulated the problem well enough, or we're not bringing our people along. Yes, there's technology involved as well, but like we've also seen in previous releases, whether it's GPT-5 or 4 or 3, some of them were more groundbreaking than others. But technology itself isn't necessarily the limiting factor. I like that you mentioned the MIT study. I was going to bring that up too. I need to update my slides. I need to tell you that. For years I've been saying it's the 85%. Even here on the back cover of the AI Leadership Handbook, it says 85% of AI projects fail. That goes back to 2018 when Gartner said, don't deliver value, not just fail. Now we're at 95. Okay, fine. But I think it goes back again to this fundamental part of, have we even understood what the problem is that we're trying to solve? The second part for me is also something that I've been sharing for years, is don't build everything yourself just because you can. There are vendors, there are companies out there that do that for a living, that do that in the areas that you use software in anyways. So look, where opportunities is there AI in these products we already use? How do we get it? Is it an additional subscription? Is it a higher tier? Does it even add value? And start there instead of first building your AI platform and everything else around it for this one little use case that might or might not play out the way you hope to.
absolutely. And I want to talk a little more about this AI readiness concept that we touched on in past episodes, because we did get some feedback on that. But one thing I wanted to also share that I think is a really interesting juxtaposition with this sort of like broader sort of failure rates thing and the GPT-5 underwhelming release, and these other vendors that are also, I think, really releasing more, like whether it's Grok or Anthropic, releasing more, I would say, incremental improvements in a lot of ways, rather than like drastic jumps like we have between GPT 2, 3, and 4, for example. But as a contrast to that, I was watching a video on YouTube, and I'm not going to call out the video because I'm actually somewhat critical of part of it, and I don't want to like get into this whole back and forth with this person, but it had to do with churning LLMs into like domain experts, and I think this is kind of the heart of the enterprise play. And so what this individual said is, when it comes to vertical AI applications, the systems that you build for incorporating your domain insights is far more important than the sophistication of your models and your pipelines. So they were saying the limitation these days is not how powerful your model is, but it's more, does it understand the context in your industry for your customer, and does it perform the way you need to for that industry? And so I think that's really interesting because, how do you apply these large language models to specialized industries? Well, there's kind of a so-called last mile problem. And the last mile problem has to do with giving that model the specific information, context, and understanding for that particular industry setting. And that becomes really important. And when you take that on, there's really promising ground that can be made. But the key thing to understand there is that LLMs out of the box aren't going to understand a lot of these specialized contexts, because even though they've been trained on the vast internet, like they haven't necessarily been trained on these very specific domains and this customer specific data for a variety of reasons, including the privacy part. And so that's the really interesting contrast, I think. And so you have someone like this talking about achieving, upwards of, 90, 95, 98% accuracy rates in those domains, focused on these specific constrained problems. And that's really exciting. Now, one of the really interesting questions is that enterprise promise that I think people are starting to see, is that enough to maintain the whole AI economy? And the question is uncertain, because the big AI companies are counting on valuations that I think extend like pretty far beyond that. So this doesn't necessarily save the whole AI economy, but actually I think what it does is it creates opportunities for people like you and me, and opportunities for vendors that focus on the enterprise to bear down on these industry problems and provide LLMs with the context they might not have.
I think so too, right? And to me, there's so much potential that is still untapped. And I see that largely, like we've talked about in our previous episodes, in the small and medium sized business sector. People and organizations who have a need to drive more automation to increase the speed that their business is able to function at, but who might not necessarily have the deep pockets or the resources like larger organizations or global organizations do, to get consultants to fix this, or build an army of engineers to do that for them. And I think there's a huge opportunity in at least two areas. One, how do we use the tools that are available to us? Again, could be things like Copilot or ChatGPT or some other tools. Some basic AI literacy. How do I use these tools safely, responsibly? How do I make sure that whatever I pass on to my colleague or to my customer has been checked by myself or by somebody on the team, so I don't just generate AI slop and send it on? That on one hand. But on the other hand, how can we, in very concrete ways, optimize and automate some of our standard processes? And maybe that could be an RFP process. Right? We send an RFP out to a number of suppliers, then we get responses, and now we need to figure out what did they respond to, which parts can they actually complete, and all of these things where you have a lot of people doing this work still today, as one example, right? Or again, content creation, newsletters, simple things where organizations have people doing these tasks for a good amount of their time, a week or a month. And we're not tapping into those yet. So to me, that's a big area. I also want to say I was just in Europe for a couple of weeks, and the conversation there was really, really interesting. When this topic of data and agents came up, yes, models are great. They're trained on vast bodies of information and language, but they don't know your specific business data and processes and product formulas and what have you. The next topic that came up was, well, maybe it's small language models that are either specialized or trained on industry knowledge, or that you fine-tune on your business data. That could be one approach. The next topic that came up was, well, are we seeing a pendulum that keeps swinging from on-premise to cloud, and now with costs and privacy concerns? To me, that seems to be more of a European topic. Are we seeing the pendulum swing back, and are organizations, larger organizations, putting NVIDIA hardware back in their data center to run these models on their premise so they have better control? Just two of the big questions that came up, and to me that they're super fascinating. I'm not seeing that here in the US yet. I don't know if you are. I think here it's still API based. We call a model from somewhere. Certainly some organizations, some industries that are more concerned about what's happening with my data. What do vendors potentially do with the data and with the prompts they have? But it was more noticeable in these conversations that I had in Europe.
Yeah, and this is part of this experiments in a good way that people are going to find in terms of what are the right size models for their use cases. And in some cases, I've talked with vendors who start with larger models and then are able to scale that down, which is sort of a little bit like what DeepSeek did to some extent. But basically, like you can kind of diffuse or boil models down to smaller models once you have established a use case. But there are characteristics of different size models that have to be analyzed too. Like, for example, larger models are often better at sort of the language understanding part. So if you have customer facing stuff, you might want the larger model that does a better job of understanding what the customer is saying, because they might use different words that mean the same thing, and the larger models are going to be better at that kind of understanding. Whereas, but if you have, for example, a team of super users using an internal model, they can be taught like the right ways to interact with that model, and so they might do just fine on a smaller model where they realize, okay, I need to prompt it with these kinds of words, but it won't understand these other words. And so it's just really interesting. And I did a podcast this week with Aaron Harris, CTO of Sage, and they essentially found they had to train an LLM because out of the box LLMs just didn't understand finance terms well enough to actually use them. And so we got into that in the podcast, and that's really interesting because sometimes you'll need to do that. Other times you won't need to do that. And other vendors are doing just fine, like using RAG and tool call type context and using a more out of the box model. So again, it comes down to use case, but like in the case of the finance one, for example, in the podcast, we talked about how if you ask a question like, what stock item will I need to reorder soon? ChatGPT wasn't recognizing that as an accounting question. It didn't recognize the accounting terms. And so the Sage model that they built, it understands that stock refers to inventory, and that's the world the model is operating in. And so, you know, it just depends on your use case. And that's why you have to kind of dive into this with expert partners and expert advisors to help you to kind of head down that right path. But if you do, I think you start to build on these use cases and start to notch some real wins here, even though it in the background you have this study that says 90% of projects fail. But the thing is, the kind of projects that are failing, in my opinion, are not the kind that you and I are talking about right now.
Right. That brings up a good point in memory. I did a webinar a couple of weeks ago with Cycus, who are in the procurement space. And we had a panel of experts and also got lots of questions from the audience. And some of the audience questions were like, hey, with AI and especially agentic AI, what can I do in procurement? And there were some really, really great examples where they said, hey, look, for example, something like long tail. Right? You have individual vendors or users in your business that buy from individual vendors, but it's not at a volume where you can negotiate large discounts or larger contracts. And it's hard to manage, and it's hard to analyze the spend and categorize it and consolidate it. So people are not doing it. But now with agentic AI, they said, hey, we can actually do that. So we are not replacing people doing this job because nobody's doing it anyways, and we're getting businesses better insights so they can consolidate spend, optimize their category management, and drive real value in business results from that. So to me, that was a great example, because also what I heard over the summer was the whole debate about are entry-level jobs going away, and everybody panicked. And we looked at labor statistics, and STEM graduates seem to be in a higher unemployment category this year than they have been previously. Things like that. And then luckily also the debate switched to, well, if we don't have entry-level roles, how are they becoming senior? Who are the next senior and expert level roles? So no, please don't just eliminate the need for early in career roles. You need to figure that out too. So anyways, two stories in one. One is the where do we deploy agentic AI and how can it add value? Things like long tail spend in procurement, where we're not looking at this anyways. And on the other hand, we're not taking jobs away. And this mindset, I think, is really, really important, because I also see too many leaders think about, where can I cut cost? Where can I cut spending? Where can I reduce headcount? Where, to me, the bigger question is, what can I enable if I have this booster, this not just productivity booster, but different insights, new insights, scaling our knowledge, scaling our information acquisition and retrieval and reasoning. And I'm not seeing a lot of leaders think about that yet, but would absolutely encourage them to rather approach that mindset than where can I save?
Yeah, and this is something you and I hit on in our last discussion around use cases, is the importance of companies really, I think, taking a step back and deciding what their innovation is heading towards in their industry. Like, what do they want to be known for? And I'm hoping that a lot of companies want to be known for the way in which they excel in how they serve their customers and and the opportunities they provide from employees. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not going to want to also be operationally efficient. Of course they do. But it's so important to have those goals firmly in mind because, as we discussed in our service scenario last time, it affects your decisions on whether you're going to deploy AI to serve customers better, for example, round the clock after your service employees go home, whether you're going to use that to reduce your service team, or ideally, based on the use case I wrote about, like enhance the service you can provide to VIP customers by taking admin off the plate of your. So again, it's the same kind of thing, and the same is true from the talent side, right? Like, do you want to use AI to cultivate talent, as you were talking about, or are you going to use it to just get rid of your junior staff if you can get away with that? I would argue that a lot of junior staff are more talented than bots still, but let's just say that you're going to try that. Well, that becomes a very self-defeating model going forward. And so you need to ultimately make technology, I don't care if it's blockchain or AI or whatever you think, subservient to your bigger goal, and don't allow the technology to take over the goal and say, well, I can't help it, AI claimed those jobs. It's like, no, they claim those jobs because you allowed that to happen.
Yeah.
You can redeploy those people, you can treat them differently. And when we talk about AI readiness, which will be, I think, the next topic in our discussion here, a big part of that, I think, is the cultural part of how do you cultivate a culture of employees that is excited about using these tools and not having them being imposed upon them or feel like I got to work harder because I'm going to lose my job, but more like I'm being provided with secure ways of experimenting with these tools so that I can ideate use cases for my company to excel. That's the kind of environment you want to create.
So that brings me back to the MIT study that we talked about at the beginning. And one of the nuggets in there was we need to empower middle managers to empower their teams and their team members. It's not just done if we say, you need to use AI, right? Where AI first, you need to use AI because your employees are struggling. They don't know what this means. Where do I start? How do I even use it? How do I know that something I create is good? Maybe they don't even know that you can create something that is not good or factually inaccurate. So I heard two great examples last week in a session that I did. And one of the participants said, yes, our leadership team is AI first, says you need to use AI in our company. And people look around and say, what does it mean? So I helped them figure out, hey, here's how you can use, for example, ChatGPT or Copilot or AI in other parts. Another participant said, well, we're going about this a different way. Our leadership also encourages the use of AI, but we have smaller groups or communities of multipliers or champions, if you will, and we come together and we say, here's how I use it in my function. Here's how I use it in marketing. Here's how I use it in sales. This is what's worked really well. Here's how I got to that point. Here's what I had to change. Here's where it fails. And so we create this culture of shared learning and community-based learning. And we accept AI as a new technology, as a new way of working, but still with a mandate of we want to use more AI to be more efficiently and effective, but also, give that opportunity to learn together and share visibility, share praise of how people are using that in our organization. To me, those were two excellent examples. The same goal, different execution, and very likely different results as well.
Yeah, and if you can get your hands on the report, and hopefully it will be issued at some point, they get into this 5% and what made those 5% successful. And it's really quite interesting to dig into that a little bit. And the more successful areas are no surprise. They're high value use cases that are integrated deeply into workflows, scale through continuous learning rather than broad feature sets. So less generic sort of productivity things, but more looking at very specific functions that can be automated. A lot of interesting, they talk a lot about back office admin being successful as opposed to throwing all of the money into sort of various marketing and sales agendas, though though they did note that lead gen can be a successful area as well as service. So I think what this report didn't get into is that a lot of these industrial use cases are gaining momentum too. I talked with a vendor just last week about some of their success, starting to embed shop floor type functionality. You can start with things like quality assurance and equipment monitoring, things like that. You're not giving agents control over your shop floor yet necessarily, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff. And again, it comes down to like customers that are ready. And what I'm seeing is that the reason the AI readiness topic is powerful is because AI remains an accelerant to me, which is that if you have really good processes and good data platforms in place, AI is just going to help you outperform that much better. But if you are struggling in those areas, I don't believe that today's AI can save you from yourself by applying that onto problematic data, siloed data, problematic process flows, lack of leadership buy-in, stifling workplace cultures, people clinging to their jobs like life raft. These things are not conducive to AI deployments. And so that's why the AI readiness conversation is so important, because when you apply AI, you enhance what you're good at, but AI can't make you good at things you're not good at already.
Beautifully said. I don't even know what I should add to that, other than a confirming nod in your direction. There's an additional component to me that I've been thinking about a lot more lately. I hosted Steve Wilson, one of the co-leads of the OWASP Top 10 for LLMs report, several times on their show a couple of weeks ago as well. And we got into this topic of, well, how do you secure your agentic AI? And I saw some interesting examples of vendors out there thinking about security and identity and authentication. And they got me thinking too, right? Today, we have largely humans sitting in front of a screen, clicking on the screen manually. Maybe you have some service accounts or some API keys if there's something happening in the background. But now already with agents, we have a non-human entity that acts on your behalf or that acts on your company's behalf. And a lot of times, when we talk about AI, we talk about agents, we talk about my company view. How can I use this? How can I optimize my process? How can I operate? How can I improve my operations? But again, there are two, maybe three things that I think we're not talking about enough yet. One is, how do you build and scale and configure your operations for agents on the other side that will send you requests all of a sudden much more quickly at a higher pace, a higher velocity, a higher volume, and what have you? Are your systems designed for that? Or how do they need to change? How do we need to think about agents at some point doing business with other agents? Is that other agent even trusted and trustworthy? Are they really representing who they say they are? Is it really my business partner that's behind this and their agent interacting with my agent? So trust, security, authentication, even in this scenario between companies, becomes much, much more important than what we're just talking about, and we're just scratching the surface with, is that agent in my business even authenticated and trusted?
Exactly. And the thing that I have seen again and again this summer is that we cannot underestimate the security issues involved here, and their new threat vectors, and the risk management around this is really, really important. And one way to think about this too is a little bit of a difference, like between a human scenario where if you welcome someone into your house because you trust them, like if you think about it, an agent would do the same thing. But if you say, well, you have free run of the house, do whatever you want, like an agent might do that too and just let you do whatever you want once it's kind of like authorized you. Like it's not going to ask questions. Whereas a human, if you started rifling through my laptops and stuff, even though I gave you free run of the house, I might be like, well, I don't need you running through my laptops right now. What do you need right now? Agents aren't really well equipped to ask those kinds of questions once you've been granted access. And the access you're giving these systems is quite powerful. So it's not a deal breaker, but it's something where you have to have this on the forefront of your mind at all times, and it's important.
Yeah. See, even on a smaller scale, say you're a sole proprietor or a small business owner. Yes, you have access to tools like Manus or things like OpenAI's Operator, or now the automation workflows, basically. But what happens when you give it access and it sends confidential information to another customer, to another prospect? It wasn't intended for them. They shouldn't see what you quote your actual intended recipient, but now they do. Big miss, right? So to what extent do you give these agents, these technologies, access to your system, to your data, and how do you mitigate those risks? I think that's a real question that we need to ask as well, that vendors also need to help figure out if they want to see more adoption. It's fine that it can click on a screen and it does things independently, even if it takes a little longer than how we would do it as humans. But I think this part of risk management, risk mitigation, and just understanding of what could go wrong and what could that mean, I think is so important as well in this discussion. And especially as we're talking so much about hype and all the future and everything that it's going to enable. It works well until it doesn't. And then the question is, who's at fault? What's the damage? So it's better to think about that up front, as always.
Indeed. So since we last talked on the AI readiness topic, I spent a lot of time looking at this, and I think we've kind of covered a lot of different components of that, things like leadership and culture and process, discipline, and data. But the interesting thing is that the data part still is something that a lot of vendors are arguing over, in terms of, it does seem very, very clear that AI services thrive on different kinds of data presentations than we typically have had in the past. And so what's the most optimal way to do it? And some are saying, well, you need a real-time live data stream because AI thrives on the latest live data, right?
Yep.
And that's true to a point, but then there are times where real time can be prohibitively expensive in certain domains. And I talked with some vendors about this who were saying, well, yeah, that's true, but in some systems that I might need for AI, they're not being updated in real time, but that's okay. I just need the most. So you're back kind of to the right time thing. And then, some people talk more about cloud-based access and how important that is. Other people insist that it doesn't need to be in the cloud. There's a lot of discussions of edge-based devices, but I think the edge-based stuff's a little tricky because the compute on edge devices is often not enough for what you need. And then you have various cloud processing things from edge devices. So no one's figured out all of the answers to this question. I think one prevailing trend is not to move data around as much, but thinking more in terms of zero copy scenarios where data can reside where it resides, and you have some kind of intermediary system that can essentially help you with this. It's kind of a new way of thinking about middleware, but in an AI type of context, I guess you could say. No one's figured all of this out yet, and there's no way to avoid some of the pain around it. And I think the way I kind of look at it is that a core component of AI readiness is going to be your data platform vision for your company. And that's probably going to be a multi-year scenario in terms of how do you make your data most accessible to these systems. But the good news is that you're going to find that there's places where you can start, where you do have a high caliber of data. And, when people say, well, these systems can handle unstructured data, that's true to a point. But even unstructured data, these systems thrive better when that unstructured data has certain kinds of recognizable labels and formats that it can make sense of. So you're going to learn as you go a little bit what the best data is for those systems. And that's why these trusted advisors are so important. But I guess I just wanted to say that there's no consensus on all of this yet. But the one good thing that we know is that starting with areas where you have quality data is a really, really good idea, because you need to be doing actual live work with quality data to see what the results are and iterating on that, rather than testing these systems with data that is not your own, because it will not give you the input that you need on whether to go forward or not.
See, I spoke in Munich at an event a couple of weeks ago, and afterwards, some attendees came up to me and said, "Well, you talk about AI, you talk about the need for good data, clean data, fresh data, accurate data, all of that. We know that our business and our data is nothing like that, and we're not the only ones, right? So how can we do this? Because we've been trying for years getting our data in order, getting our leaders to buy into this, to get money, to get funds, and do things. We don't really have time to do a multi-year roadmap and something. What can we do, right?
Right.
And so one of my recommendations was, well, think about how can you do some parts of it as a phase 0 of your AI project. Because if your leadership, if your board gives you money to invest in AI, yes, you need to get your data house, lake house, what have you, in order to do AI. So think about, where can I weave this into existing projects or new projects that we're starting with a manageable effort to make progress? Because similar to what you said, right? It's not like data is a new topic. It's been there for years, it's been there for decades, and it hasn't been solved yet, because usually it's not the sexy, it's not the shiny thing that people want to invest in or get visibility for or credibility for. But we need to do this work now more than ever if we expect to have AI, if we expect to have agentic AI on top of that, using the data to reason, to make decisions, to generate proposals, to research informations, and all of that. So the time is now, but if you don't have a dedicated data budget or data project, see if you can weave that in as a phase 0 to an AI project before you get started with that.
Right. And a lot of, I think, the excitement that I feel about enterprise AI, I don't know about you, but it's sort of the combination of the structured and unstructured data, because behind transactions in systems are back channel conversations about particular customers and relevant information around the history of interaction with that customer. And the idea of kind of combining all of that into one way of engaging with the system to kind of find out, like, tell me more about this customer, not just their sales history, but the feedback that we've gotten from them and all of that. And like having all of that as part of one workflow is so appealing. And the good news is that a lot of companies have somewhere. I don't think it's necessarily that it has to be cloud, but the reason why cloud products have been appealing is that when you move to a SaaS product, a lot of times a different level of data discipline is imposed upon you, because you need to become a little more sort of vanilla, if you will, in order to fit into a classic SaaS environment. So what you're looking for from a structured data perspective in terms of AI readiness is systems that are not incredibly heavily customized internally, but are a little more out of the box, you could say, where you have had to impose some discipline around the structure, and you have had to work through some meta issues around customer names or regions or whatever it is. You're looking for stuff like that. And like you said, everyone has been burned by these initiatives in the past. But the good news is that with these iterative projects, you are going to have the ability to come back to your team and your leadership team and say, okay, we started by working with this. The data was already pretty clean here. We got a win. We were able to increase customer satisfaction. We were able to reduce turnover. We were able to, land new clients or optimize lead gen or whatever it is. And that gets leaders excited. And then you can say, and now we need to go a little further here. And so that's the hope from in the past, where in the past the problem was we were doing these massive cleansing efforts, but there was never really any external result. It was kind of like, well, when we finally get it done, now we can look for the use cases. But the idea here is that you're rolling out the use cases as you're cleaning the data. That's the distinction here. And if you can do that, I think you will be able to develop momentum to move into the thorny areas. And it will happen, because what you're going to run into is your users or your customers are going to ask questions of your AI system that it can't answer because it doesn't have access to certain data. and then that's going to be your next project, is to be like, how do we add that data into this mix? So,
and it sounds like that's a much better problem to have than the agent answering questions where it does not have the data and
right.
making things up, right?
Oh, much better, yeah.
So definitely lots to do and lots to work on, for sure. We said that today we'll talk about what's next. We covered security, trust, and authentication. We talked about AI readiness on one hand, getting your people and your leaders ready, and on the other hand, data being a big topic, where we need to increase that readiness to do AI on top. And I'm just super excited to see how things are moving in the industry and how quickly they are moving. From 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, roughly, the first agentic frameworks that came out, then vendors latched onto. They said, okay, here's a real opportunity, maybe to some also a threat. We need to do something about this. Now they've shipped it. Now there's the adoption starting slowly but surely. I'm excited to see more examples. By the way, I also feel not enough companies are talking about their agentic deployments yet. I feel sometimes there are some little bits and nuggets that you pick up in the tech media and coverage, but I have seen very, very few companies out there and say, hey, here's how we've deployed it. Here's how we looked at tasks and how we broke this down into what does the agent do? What does the subject matter expert do? Very, very few, maybe for good reasons. Maybe it's the competitive advantage for those that are already ahead. But I'm sure there's more that we will see. And then to me, that also unlocks the next wave of what is possible. What should we be thinking about, right? Oh, here's company XYZ talking about this. A couple of weeks ago, right, we talked about Moderna combining IT and HR to look at roles. Whether or not that's the right approach, I think is to be seen. We'll see that probably in the next 3 to 6 months or a little later. But they're the first companies taking this initiative and this approach and looking at how can we divide work? Where do we need people because of their unique capabilities and capabilities and knowledge? And where do we need agents and how does that look? It's just moving super fast, and it's exciting to see how that progresses.
Right. And so as we kind of move to the end of this third discussion, I think on that what's next thing, when I go to the fall shows, the things I'm going to be looking for are, one of the big ones are what you just described, which is I'm going to try to document more customer success stories of what's been achieved so far and what the sort of hard-won lessons are there. And I have got a few from last spring, but I expect more in the fall. So that will be really interesting. Vendors don't always do a good job of promoting those, and a lot of times what's interesting is some of the really good ones are not necessarily heavily generative AI right now. Some of them are still very classic machine learning type examples that still have really powerful impact in terms of things like triaging an emergency room into different priority levels or something like that. It could be more of a machine learning approach or even a computer vision approach. So that's one thing, is that we want to document all of that. But then the other thing is just looking at what's next for agents. And I think for customers right now, I would say, like, start looking at MCP and tool calling as the extension of looking at like things like RAG and context. It's all about how can you make LLMs smarter by incorporating both your own data, but also external validation and supplemental tools that help with decision making and process flows. So it could be things like checking with a credit validation service externally, and start experimenting with that. And MCP is obviously one protocol that really helps with that. I would say that's sort of the next phase, is start to look at how to make them smarter for the things that you want to do by taking advantage of the data, both internally and from in so-called tool calling, which does include that RAG context, but also much more. Where I would say keep a wary eye for now, but a curious eye, is around the agent-to-agent protocols and A2A and stuff like that. And what you will hear a lot from with vendors this fall is around orchestrating multi-agent workflows across domains. You're going to hear a whole lot about that. And the reason for that is that every vendor wants to be the agentic system of record for their customers. So they want to basically say, you can count on us to do that. And then other vendors like the Boomies and the UiPaths of the world are trying to be more like the Switzerlands of these scenarios by saying, well, we don't have a dog in this fight, like, but we're going to orchestrate this for you as well. Now, all of that kind of talk is very useful, but I think right now, proceed with caution when you think about the potential to hand off agentic workflows across vendors, because that's where it's going to be a little more heavy lifting right now in terms of getting the results you want. It's not that you shouldn't look at it, but I think right now focus on getting some internal workflows going within the context of maybe one vendor or maybe two that work very closely together that have a really good partnership. Nail that down first, and then we can kind of look ahead to the prospect of more agent to agent communication going forward. But the stats on multi-agent handoffs right now just aren't that great, and the more complex the workflows are, the more problems you could run into. So I would say keep an eye on that because it's really promising, but start with stuff where you can get some wins.
I love it. That's very practical advice. Look at what's there. How do you use these protocols and technologies? Experiment with it so you become more knowledgeable and overall more experienced as these protocols and solutions mature as well. And also the recommendation that every vendor wants or needs to say, we're doing something with AI and you can do it with us, I think makes perfect sense. To me, it comes down to where do you have an investment? Where do you have a beachhead already? If it's this solution or that solution, it might be easier to go here or go there and maximize your investments.
And by the way, just real quick, one of the reasons
Sure.
why I think both MCP and A2A are worth tracking is because so many vendors that you might think of as competitors have signed on to these particular protocols. And that's really, really important because in the history of enterprise software, the standards that have done the best are the ones where the competitors sign on to the same frameworks. And so when you see folks like Microsoft, Salesforce, SAP, Oracle signing on to the same standards, that tells you that there's some promise there. But again, let some of the deep pockets like venture into the hardest aspects of that first and let them take some of the bruising lessons, but definitely be watching. I think my final thing for you would be kind of since you have been to a bunch of things lately and I was doing more deep dive research from home, what would you say was the most memorable like interaction you had with like a customer or someone that asked you questions around what they're doing? Was there anything that really jumped out, like that surprised you? Or
So, I usually give a lot of talks and keynotes here in North America. So being in Europe for a couple of weeks was super refreshing because I got a whole different perspective, whether there was more an IT leadership audience or mixed group from financial services and venture capital and so on. But the one event that I spoke at in Switzerland, I got so many deep and thoughtful questions that I haven't gotten in a long time over here, to be honest. And one of those questions was around how do we make sure that these models are fair and safe and unbiased, and especially if we have certain vendors building this basic technology. And then again, within certain vendors, there are certain tendencies, right? More conservative leaning, for example, more progressive, more guardrails, fewer guardrails. And then what if we have these tools here and LLMs more with a Western lens and corpus of data compared to more on the east or the far east. So how does it work? How do you leverage it or mitigate for it? Do you need different models? And so just a good, very broad and from my point of view, deep discussion. And I would say at the
did you
moment,
have a good answer for dealing with bias in these models?
so I think if it was good is for the audience to judge. I think I did have a good answer, and my answer was think about where do you deploy these models and what do you deploy them for. Yes, there are some biases in there, so we need to figure out how do we check them and do evaluation. But if you know that you deploy models on a global scale for different audiences, maybe indeed consider using a Qwen or DeepSeek more for Far East in the Claude, Anthropic, and what or OpenAI models for more westernized scenarios. But that's also, by the way, where the small language model discussion came up, to say, well, what is it that you're trying to optimize for for this model to be really, really good at? So maybe a smaller model that has more specific domain knowledge about your industry, about your business, could be the solution as well. But to me, the big thing is that these models are never free of any values. Right? We use language to train them. Language, predominantly English, where there are certain worldviews and biases encoded in that language anyways.
Yep.
The words that we use, that we speak, that we write. So naturally, these values are encapsulated in these models. So we need to be aware of that. But that's a much, much longer topic in discussion to get into, but maybe also a good challenge for all of you to think about. What if you have something that's more Western leaning or progressive, or Western and more conservative, or US based more conservative, if you will, with Grok, or you have something like DeepSeek and Qwen with different worldviews and ideologies? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, and I'll just add really quickly to that, because you're right, we don't have time for a deep discussion on bias today, but it might be interesting to revisit that topic. I really like when companies take a proactive approach to that, but of course not all of them will. But I will point out that the EU AI Act has a really good risk framework that is worth understanding and applying to all of your AI initiatives, and potentially embedding it into your development and design process, regardless of whether you do business in the EU or not. And the reason for that is that those risk levels roughly correspond with your likelihood to get sued by people based on the misuse of those scenarios. And I can think of lawsuits going on right now in the US that pertain to the high risk areas in the EUA Act. It's got nothing to do with that legislation, but it's got to do with the fact that when you play in risk areas, you're gonna attract legal attention. And so and you're gonna need to have a plan for that. And so absolutely, these discussions are not just about, oh, my company has great values, so I want to confront bias. You also have legal exposure if you don't.
Yeah, and I think especially software vendors, right? There are certain cases in the judicial system at the moment about bias for resume screening and candidate matching and things like that. Things you can look up independently as well. But for me, the big thing of what's next is really this part of, we need to enable the workforce. You need to enable your workforce to use AI and do it responsibly. So you're not just off the hook by using ChatGPT or Copilot and you're done. But how do we empower line managers, middle managers, to empower their teams and their team members to use AI and give them guidelines to say, hey, here's how I want you to use it. Right? In many ways, they'll be similar to how we expect people to work with each other within our own team or across teams. So if you're thinking about, well, how do I do that? First of all, think about, how do you get people within your team or across teams to work together? What are the standards of quality that you expect people to follow? And how can you communicate that now in simple ways? Right? Like I shared over our last two episodes, I've been working with LinkedIn Learning on 2 courses there that I'm super excited about to be recording shortly. So keep an eye out for those. But I think that's the next practical frontier at the very foundational and base level. That's what's keeping me busy and excited at the moment.
Excellent. Great stuff, man. That seems
All
like a good place to stop.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jon, thank you so much for joining.
Yeah.
I'm always super amazed by how quickly we, come up with a topic and then just run with it totally unscripted. So that's a lot of fun to see at the end where we've taken it over the past 50 some minutes. So thank you so much for joining and for sharing your experience and expertise with us.
Great talk. Till next time.
Till next time. Bye-bye.